They laugh in the chart room, enamel mugs clicking as a ceiling fan thumps the humid air. Staff officers tap pencils on convoy tables and joke that the American flying boat is a relic from a museum. Big, slow, and easy silhouette for any gunner with steady hands. Along the piers, skippers nod and play along. Night is their ally. After sunset, the archipelago becomes a veil. Barges creep at barely 2 knots under jungle shadows. Coal-smudged destroyers of the Tokyo Express sprint the slot and vanish with the dawn, and harbor lights flicker back on like nothing happened. The ocean keeps their secrets when the sky is black. Then the night changes without warning. A lookout blinks at a shape that should not be there, a smudge against the moon that refuses to be a cloud. Engines murmur so softly they sound like faraway surf. A black wing glides at treetop height, low enough to taste river fog, and is gone before the brain decides what it saw. Another follows, and another. Navigation lamps, no swagger, just a steady patience that belongs to hunters who choose the hour. The first flare drops with a hiss like a fuse, blossoms, and the anchorage becomes noon. Shadows flee. Every dent in a drum, every rope on a pier, every white wake from a startled boat writes itself in hard light. Searchlights claw upward and find only glare. Tracers drift aimless, beautiful, and useless. In wheelhouses, men reach for throttles, then freeze as the second truth arrives. The dark no longer protects movement, and movement draws fire. Engines die along the quay, one by one, as crews cut switches and pray that stillness will make them invisible. It does not. A burst walks through a barge line. A depth charge tumbles into a channel mouth and turns water into a wall. From the edge of the harbor, a black hole skims past, so close that someone swears he could read the stenciling, if only the letters were not swallowed by paint. The laughter from the chart room belongs to another season now. The pilots who once mocked flying boats grip their controls and stare into light they did not invite, learning a new rule in a single heartbeat. The night itself has chosen sides, and it is not theirs. They called it a throwback even when it was new, a parasol wing flying boat with a boat hull for a belly, broad as a barge and slow as patience. By daylight, the PBY Catalina looked like a target that refused to hurry. But night is a different kingdom, and in that kingdom the old shape learned new magic. The makeover began with paint matte black, brushed and sprayed until aluminum vanished into shadow. Moonlight slid off it. Stars forgot to reflect. Flame dampers wrapped the exhaust, so the hot breath of the engines no longer wrote orange signatures along the nacelles. The big boat stopped announcing itself. It started absorbing the dark. Into the nose went a surface search. Radar simple enough to trust and strong enough to whisper that a coastline was near or a ship's wake was crossing the bow. Radios multiplied. Not for chatter, but for discipline. Bearings, ranges, times on target spoken in clipped phrases that turned long nights into choreography. Extra ammo stowed where weight allowed. Parachute flares packed like silver spears in tubes. Sometimes a mine, sometimes a depth charge, sometimes stubby torpedoes for the rare harbor prints that refused to run. Nothing glamorous, just tools for work done at treetop height and mast height and sea level, where errors are measured in feet and seconds. The crews changed with the airplane. Daylight training taught altitude and formation. This new trade taught shoreline navigation by nose and ear. Pilots learned to smell mangroves before they saw them, to feel where river fog pools and how surf sounds against a reef at slack water. Navigators sold their watches to new God's wind, current, and sound-building mental atlases of coves and channels, as if the coast itself were a moving map. Gunners learned the discipline of one pass, no heroics, no turning fights. Bombardiers practiced skip bombing until their hands could time the fuse by muscle memory. The checklist became a whispered liturgy. Blacked out lamps, throttles set to a note the night could not track, altimeters cross-checked against a sixth sense that says you are too low long before the panel agrees. Doctrine followed the crews. The lesson was not speed, it was endurance. A Catalina could loiter for well over a dozen hours, circling a harbor mouth or pacing a coastline until the enemy moved because the tide said he must, or the schedule said he would. Fast airplanes arrive and leave, slow airplanes wait. Waiting turned into ambush. An aircraft that would never win a dogfight became a ghost that chose the hour, the height, and the target, and left before a duel could even form. If a destroyer sprinted the slot in darkness, the cat would be overhead before the spray dried. If barges hugged mangroves, the cat would be there when the wind shifted, and the smell of diesel betrayed them. If a base blacked out, a single flare would make noon out of midnight and reveal everything that mattered. On the ground, maintainers turned the obsolete into inevitable. They scuffed the new paint dull where it shone. Safety wired the dampers that kept fire invisible, tuned the radar until it could read a harbor's bones through low cloud. Crew chiefs counted flares like coins and slipped an extra drum of ammunition into any corner that would take it. The hull was patched and repatched from rough water landings and Dumbo rescues. because the airplane that hunted by night also saved by day. Other reason crews trusted it with their hours and their lives. Even the way the Catalina sounded changed. Wide throttles at low RPM made a murmur instead of a shout. At mast height, that murmur blended with wind and water until a lookout could not tell engine from surf. Painted black, breathing quiet, guided by simple radar and strong nerves, the flying boat slid over palms so low leaves might brush the hull. From a pier, it seemed the night itself had grown wings. By then, the joke about museum pieces had lost its punchline. The PBY did not need to be new to be decisive. It needed a doctrine that matched its gifts. Speed dazzles in daylight. At night, endurance, stealth, and discipline win. The Catalina's second life proved it. What the enemy could not outclimb or outturn, he could still outweight until a black wing taught him he could not. The old airplane that once trailed the war became the pace car of the dark, writing quiet verdicts across lagoons and channels. Not now, not yet, now. Then the flare bloomed, the water flashed, and the ghost was already gone. The hunting kit lived in the bomb bay and along the hull, simple tools chosen for a single truth. At night, certainty beats spectacle. General-purpose bombs rode inboard on shackles, fuses set so a skipping drop would bite before a ship could turn. Parachute flares lay in tubes like silver javelins, each one built to bloom into a tiny sun and hang over water long enough to right every pier and wake in hard light. For enemies that hid under the surface, depth charges sat armed to shallow settings, timed to turn a channel into a hammer. Mines waited for harbor mouths and narrow cuts sown where tide and traffic forced the enemy to pass. And on chosen nights, when a prize justified the risk, slim torpedoes hung beneath the wings, rare, heavy, and final. The choreography began far from searchlights. Radar whispered a coastline in a scatter of returns. The navigator's finger traced a last dogleg to come in upwind and upmoon. The crew moved through a silent checklist practiced until it felt like breathing. Lights out. Cowl flaps set. Propellers at a low, steady note the night cannot separate from surf. Mixture and boosts trimmed for a flat approach. Blister hatches unlatched. Guns unsafe until the last moment. In the black, talk shrank to single words. Range, bearing, time. One Catalina worked as the flare ship. She slid ahead of the formation and climbed a little, enough to own the first look. The bombardier armed a tube and counted with his thumb on the panel, 1 beat for drift, 1 for wind, then kicked a flare into the dark. It fell a long second, hissed alive, and the harbor below became high noon in a hard white circle. In that instant the map turned real. Barges chained, boat astern. Lighters clustered near a fuel dump, patrol craft nosing toward a channel. Searchlights lunged and confused their own gunners. Tracers spiraled without a target. Water reflected everything and helped no one. Behind the flare ship came the strikers. They stayed low, just above mast height, and attacked on skip-bombing runs that turned physics into a favor. A bomb released at speed and at the right angle would strike the sea, ricochet once or twice, and hit the hull at or just below the waterline before the fuse's short delay expired. No need to be perfect, only close and disciplined. The pilot held the throttles at the agreed notch, eyes on the bow wave, hands quiet. The bombardiers called and broke the night, and the blast followed like a period at the end of a sentence. The rule remained sacred, 1 pass only. No turn back, no second look. Break off into blackness before the enemy could stitch the air where you had been. A third element worked the strafe and scatter. Waist gunners in the bow mount raked barge strings and piers, searching for fuel drums and ammunition stacks that would turn flame into force. Their goal was not a duel. It was disruption to blind searchlight crews to make helmsmen overcorrect, to push small craft into each other's wakes and throw a channel into confusion. In the same window, another cat might seed mines across the harbor mouth. Dropped in a pattern that mirrored tide and traffic, they turned tomorrow night into a trap without a single shot fired. When a submarine wake showed as a pale scar in the glare, the flare ship pivoted to a depth charge run, arming at a shallow setting and walking charges along the line until the water bucked and rolled. Every action ran on seconds, not minutes. The flare's drift set the clock, the wind smeared the light. The first bursts of flak mapped the angles that were safe for only a heartbeat. Crews rehearsed each attack until their muscles carried the timing. The throttle squeeze that keeps speed without climbing. The sight picture that equals 1 skip and a bite. The brake turn that slides you into darkness without silhouetting the next ship in line. If a torpedo ride had been chosen, the doctrine grew even stricter. Long set up outside the light, nose pointed at the beam, drop at the book speed and height. Then a wide, cold exit into black water while the weapon ran its own straight war beneath the glare. The kit was humble. The dance was exact. Flares made the world. Bombs signed it. Charges and mines edited the parts no one could see. Above it all ran a discipline that never begged for heroics. The Black Cats did not stay to admire results. They arrived, acted, and vanished, leaving behind harbors that roared like furnaces and coastlines that learned to fear the sound of a low, even engine that could be river or wind until the night turned into noon and the counting began. You begin the run long before anyone on the water knows there is a run. The navigator leans into a red glow, sliding a pencil along a coastline he can't see yet but knows by heart, a point that smells of mangrove, a river mouth that always throws a slick when the tide turns, a sand spit that reshapes itself with every storm. Dead reckoning carries you the last leg time, airspeed, drift, while the surface search set, whispers ranges in a voice so soft it feels like superstition. Out the open blister, the night is wet and warm. There's the sweet rot of jungle, the iodine of tide pools, the faint diesel that tells you men are moving things where charts say there's only dark. The crew speaks in single-word stitches, bearing, range, wind. The captain slides the throttles down to a note that will not carry, props at a slow, even bite. Cowl flaps are set, lamps are blacked. The hands that have done this 100 times touch the same switches in the same order without looking. Up moon and upwind, you turn into the last dogleg so the flare will fall behind your beam and the smoke will blow away from your eyes. The altimeter says you are honest. Your ribs say you are low. It is time. The flare ship climbs just enough to own the first look. The bombardier counts in his head the way a man counts heartbeats, pulls the release, and a silver spear slips into the night. For a breath there is nothing, then a hiss, then a white sun blooms over the harbor and the world arrives all at once. Barges chained in lines like beads, lighters stacked near oil drums, a patrol craft turning by habit toward the channel. Men on deck flinch at the impossible noon. Searchlights claw the sky and knit together a web that blinds the very gunners who begged for it. Tracers lift in lazy arcs and lose themselves in glare. The water mirrors chaos. You do not answer with a duel, you answer with geometry. The first striker slides an off-axis at mast height, nose just a hair low, so the sea throws a narrow ribbon of light past the bow. The throttles hold the agreed notch. The wings stay level no matter what the heart suggests. The bombardier's voice is no voice at all, and then the bomb skips once. Twice kisses steel at the waterline and bites with a short, cruel delay. You are already breaking before the sound arrives, yanking the cat into blackness at a shallow angle that denies every gunner the silhouette he wants. Never fight fair. Never stay for the second look. Behind that pass, another crew works a different problem. Their flare drifts, and they walk their run along a barge string with gunfire that is more scalpel than storm. Searching for the bright bloom that means fuel or ammunition has joined the argument. A third cat drops a shoal of mines in the channel mouth where tomorrow's traffic must pass. Each splash a quiet promise that the night after this one will be worse. If a pale wake betrays a submarine under the glare, someone arms shallow and lays a row of depth charges like stepping stones, then slides away as the water heaves and forgets its old shape. Time is the only currency that matters, and you spend it in seconds. The flare's drift sets your clock. The first bursts of flak draw lines on a map you will not cross. Your hands know when to trim one notch of prop and mixture without stealing speed. Your eyes know the sight picture that equals one skip and a bite. Your shoulders know the break that takes you into safety without silhouetting a friend. The radio is a wire pulled tight between call signs. Never more than a word at a time. Clear, north, out. On the deck of a patrol craft, a helmsman chooses wrong and throws his wake across another boat. Searchlights swing and fix on their own smoke. A barge that cut its engine to hide now drifts sideways into a pier it cannot see. The flare sizzles down and dies. Darkness tries to return and fails because the harbor is glowing where it did not glow before. You are already outside the light, throttles coming up to a climb that will not frost the engines, wings edging toward the lane you rode in. The navigator ticks his pencil, the radar breathes. The blister smells like warm salt and hot oil and a breath of something burned. There is no victory shout and no circling to count wreckage. That is daylight behavior, and daylight has nothing to teach you here. The rule that keeps you alive is the rule that becomes doctrine. Arrive unannounced, act without ceremony, vanish before anyone can compose a reply. You do not win a duel. You deny a duel. You do not own the harbor. You borrow its heartbeat for a minute and leave it off rhythm for a week. The engines settle back into their murmur. The coastline slides under your wing like a line you already drew. The convoy will not claim safety again, and no one who was there will be sure in the morning. How many airplanes came only that the night itself felt hunted. They called it a highway of shadows, New Georgia Sound. The slot-ware destroyers ran hard at night and slipped away before the sun could catch them. For months, the Tokyo Express treated harbors and staging points like safe rooms in a dangerous house, refuel in coves, load drums in lagoons, stage barges under mangroves, and wait for darkness to do the rest. Then the night changed loyalties. Over New Georgia, across Kula Gulf, along the long ribs of Bougainville, black wings began to own the hours between dusk and dawn. The black cats came in low, unlit, and unhurried, and every place the Express trusted began to feel compromised. It started with the tenders. Destroyer mothers that had once basked in moonlit harbors found themselves raked by guns that appeared out of the shoreline's breath and were gone before the first searchlight sweep made sense. A Catalina would arrive high and quiet, turn the night to noon with a single flare, and the anchorage froze in the white circle as if caught by a camera shutter. The first cat marked the shape of the target for others. Then came the skip bombing run that walked a bomb off the waterline and into plates not built for that surprise. Tenders throttled, helmsmen swung too hard, wakes crossed, and discipline unraveled under a sun that had no business shining at midnight. Depot barges were next, those patient lifelines stacked with fuel drums and ration tins. Along the coasts of New Georgia and Bougainville, the cats played a methodical game of subtraction. One pass, one line of tracers stitched across lashings and deck cargo, and the night found new colors, the quick white of ammunition letting go, the thick orange of fuel turning a quiet stream into a loud confession. Sometimes the Catalina did not stay to attack at all. It simply painted the target with flares and bearings, then backed away and let the morning killers do their work. Before first light, B-25 strafers came in fast and loud. Following the breadcrumb trail, the cats had left burning barges, smoking tenders, a channel suddenly shy of traffic. Kula Gulf learned the lesson in a single cruel tableau. A crowded lagoon carried a month's worth of risk on its surface, barge strings tied boat astern. Slower lighters rafted near a fuel line ashore, a patrol craft idling with false confidence. The flare ship slid in up-moon and dropped a string, each one blooming a little downwind of the last until the lagoon was a chain of harsh daylight. The first striker ran the outside line, dropped low, and the bomb skipped twice and bit, turning two barges into an instant furnace. A third boat, engine cut in a panic, drifted sideways and grounded on a shoal where the tide had no sympathy. Searchlights stitched the empty air where the cats had been. Tracers made glowing cursive without a subject. Hours later, a reconnaissance camera caught the aftermath. A scorched strand, water still smudged with oil, and rows of fuel drums ashore that were still burning in the morning wind. Bougainville's coves, once considered invisible, began to feel like glass bowls under a lamp. The cats would come not when gunners were fresh, but near the hour when men are least sharp, well after midnight. Well before dawn, loitering just offshore until tide and schedule forced something to move. A pilot would smell mangrove and diesel through the open blister, see a faint wake where there should have been none, and call the run with a voice that did not rise or fall. Harbor by harbor, channel by channel, the Express discovered that the real ambush was time itself, the slow airplane that could wait longer than any watch officer could stay perfect. The enemy adapted because professionals always do. Searchlight crews practiced cones, batteries plotted pre-sighted arcs. Patrol boats tried to lunge into the light instead of fleeing it. Night fighters appeared here and there, late and rare, but the math would not surrender. Fuel shortages, blunted practice, radar coverage was thin, training pipelines compressed skill into hope. The cats chose their hour, their axis, their exit, and left the defenders grasping at echoes and glare. By the time the range shifted and the campaign moved on, the slot no longer felt like a road that Japan owned. It felt like a trap baited by routine. Destroyers still sprinted when they must, but every staging point now carried a price. Tenders that once slept easy became liabilities. Barges that once slipped through jungle shadows became floating invitations. And the men who had laughed at flying boats learned a harder truth on decks slick with dew. The night itself had changed sides and it was keeping score. The map shifts west and the coast grows meaner. Buna sits in swamplight, Lié and Salamaua face a sea that changes mood by the hour. Finschhofen stares into the mouth of the Huon Gulf where reefs bite careless keels. Here the Japanese lifeline is made of wood and patience. Low, shallow draft barges that hug mangrove shadows creep behind reef lines and freeze when moonlight shows their wakes. Big ships risk too much. The jungle swallows roads. The mountains mock trucks. So the garrisons eat and fight by water, a few tons at a time, night after night until the night stops cooperating. The Catalinas arrive without hurry and without announcement. They lift at dusk and do not promise to return before dawn. Engines settled into a murmur that becomes part of the shoreline. Hours slide by. The navigator rides deed, riding down a coastline that smells of wet bark and salt. The surface search set whispers, hints, 2 miles to a spit, 1 mile to a river mouth, and the open blister carries the breath of mangroves, and sometimes the thin sting of diesel where no chart admits a ship. The crew speaks in single words, bearing, range, wind, out ahead a smudge that is not tied, then another. The first flare falls like a promise. A white sun blooms above a backwater that thought itself private, and the lagoon writes its secrets in hard light. Barges chained bow to stern, lighters rafted near drums, a patrol craft idling for the turn of the tide. The flare ship keeps its distance, drifting the glare where it hurts most. Strikers slide in at mast height, skip a bomb once, twice, then let the fuse decide. A barge becomes a bonfire. Another tries to run and finds a sandbar that did not care about schedules. Tracers float and lose themselves in the glare. Searchlights blind their own crews. The cats do not stay. They mark what survives and ease back into black water while the harbor unlearns the meaning of safe. The pattern repeats along the Huon Gulf. A dark smudge on a reef line becomes a barge train creeping toward Lehigh. A Catalina shadows the convoy just outside hearing, calls bearings in clipped phrases, and waits for the hour when the tide demands a crossing. When the barges commit to open water, the night turns to noon. Some nights the cats strike and vanish in one breath. Other nights they seed the channel with mines and leave a quiet problem for tomorrow. Before sunrise, fast B-25s or RAF Beaufighters follow the breadcrumb trail flares still smoking on the water, fresh oil on the wind, and finish what the flare ship began. The effects do not roar, they accumulate. Outposts start to ration ammunition to a few rounds per man per day. Rice becomes thin porridge and then a rumor. Quinine runs out and the sick bay becomes a waiting room. Mortar fires shorter barrages because mules cannot replace what barges no longer deliver. A staff officer in a warm city will write supply irregular in a margin. A platoon on the Huon track will discover that irregular means a silent gun when an hour ago it still spoke. You can chart the collapse in small scenes. A Catalina circles a creek mouth near Finch Fun for long minutes. Smelling diesel it cannot yet see until the tide forces a barge to move, and the first glow makes the mangrove leaves shine from beneath. 2 nights later, the same cat returns to the same bend and finds only scorched water and a crew of men on a bank who stare upward at noises they cannot place. Farther west, a cove that had fed Salamaua goes dark for a week, then for 2. A reconnaissance photo shows footprints around empty drum circles and no wakes at the mouth. None of this is decisive in a day. All of it becomes decisive in a month. The kill chain is simple and cruel. A cheap, patient airplane denies a single barge tonight. That missing barge denies a company its rations tomorrow. The hungry company yields a ridge the week after. A front that once felt solid begins to feel hollow. Fuel meant for a field battery burns on a lagoon. Ammunition meant for a strong point sits behind a mine channel. Medicine meant for a feverish battalion never leaves a beach where the flare turned midnight into noon. The cats do not need speed to win this war. They need time, and they have more of it than any barge crew can borrow. By the time Buna is a memory and Leh is a lesson, the men who run the coast at night stop telling jokes about flying boats. They keep engines warm through the small hours, not for sprint but for panic. They listen for a sound that could be wind or surf or an airplane taking a breath. And when the white sun blooms above some quiet reach of the Huon Gulf, they understand the arithmetic written against them. 1 barge, 1 night, 1 quiet subtraction at a time until the whole front feels lighter than it should, and then it moves. They work the night like a relay team, passing targets hand to hand until nothing left can float or fight. The black cats are the eyes and the clock. They lift at dusk, settle into their long murmur, and start measuring a coast that tries to stay quiet. Radar breathes ranges. The navigator sketches the tide's intentions. The blister gunner smells mangrove and diesel and knows a convoy is somewhere ahead, pretending to be part of the shoreline. When the first smudge becomes a certainty, the Catalina calls in plain, clipped phrases, bearing distance. Coarse words shaved down to meaning so no second is wasted or misunderstood. No speeches, no chatter, a grid of effort wakes up. The cat does not rush the strike, it sets the table. Up moon and up wind, the flare ship climbs a little and drops a white sun that turns a quiet inlet into a diagram. Barges chained bow to stern, tenders tucked behind a spit, a patrol craft nosing the channel like a sleepwalker. The Catalina marks the lanes with a second flare and lays a smoke float where the current will betray a submarine wake. Then it slides off-axis, low and patient, to keep the light drifting where it hurts most and to rake with short bursts that sting gunners without inviting a duel. The goal is pattern, not glory. Hold the picture steady. Keep the enemy looking the wrong way. Buy seconds for the blade that is coming. Out beyond the light, PT boats are already surging. Their engines bite the water with a high, angry note. Crews crouch behind shields. Torpedoes ride slung and ready. They never sprint straight. They pounce on zigzags, using the cat's bearings like stepping stones. The lead boat leans into a shallow turn, steadies, and looses its first fish at the angle the coxswain has rehearsed 100 times. No triumphant shout, just a quick correction, and a second shot from the wingman while tracers buzz and die in wake spray. The Catalina's gun bursts nip at searchlight crews. Not to win a firefight, but to keep heads down for the handful of heartbeats the boats need to cross the danger arc. A tender takes a hit and shudders. A barge string jerks apart as if a rope snapped. A patrol craft chooses badly and throws its wake across a torpedo track it should have respected. When the PTS break away, always wide, always fast, always into shadow, the cat resumes its slow arithmetic. If survivors try to escape the inlet, the Catalina seeds the channel mouth with minds set where tomorrow's tide will herd them. If a pale scar betrays a submerging shape, the flare ship walks depth charges along the line until the water forgets its old calm. If the harbor still crawls with small craft, the cat stays just outside the glare and calls bearings in phrases that sound like numbers but feel like decisions. The night becomes a metronome. Mark, strike, never linger. The second hand of the kill chain is time to guide in the next blow. Before dawn, the Catalina's last act is to leave a trail the morning can follow. Flares guttering to embers. A lazy stain of oil pointing down a channel, a smoke float drifting toward open water. Then the big boat turns for home with fuel enough to spare. The sky pales, and fast shadows arrive on schedule. B-20-5 strafers come first, hard and purposeful, skipping bombs into whatever still floats and stitching decks so thoroughly that crews forget which way the pier lies. Bowfighters drop to wavetop height and speak in cannon, unbuttoning tenders, snapping masts, and daring anything left to move. None of this is heroic in the storybook sense. It is completion, the last paragraph of a plan written the night before by a patient airplane, and a few short words on the radio. The discipline is the point. Everyone in the chain knows the rules. Never fight fair, never stay for the second look. Never trade a sure kill tonight for a risky pursuit that leaves the inlet alive tomorrow. The Catalina chooses hour and angle. The PT boats deliver shock at knife range. The day strikers finish what darkness began. Even the silences are part of the craft-long minutes when the cat says nothing because saying nothing keeps the picture intact, or when a PT crew throttles back to let a searchlight overshoot and blind its own gun crew. The night is not won by the fastest hull or the shiniest airframe. It is won by a system that multiplies small certainties until an enemy's logistics cannot bear them. By noon, the inlet looks ordinary again, all greens and blues from altitude, but the ledger has changed. A barge that should have arrived at not. A tender that should have refueled destroyers is smoking at anchor or gone to the bottom in shallow water. A patrol craft that should have guarded the mouth is out of action, its crew ashore and shaken. None of these losses are spectacular by themselves. Together, repeated night after night, they bend a campaign. That is the lesson your audience knows by heart. Hardware impresses. Coordination wins. The Black Cats prove it the way the best truths are proven, quietly, relentlessly, and with results that do not need a speech. The enemy learned because professionals always do. Searchlight crews stopped thrashing at random and practiced cones, layering beams so a single flare could not blind the whole battery. Coastal guns pre-sighted channel mouths and harbor bends, chalking bearings on bulkheads so a sleepy crew could throw steel down a lane without waiting for orders. Patrol boats drilled on blacked-out approaches. And in some sectors, night fighters finally arrived. The J-1 and Gecko, a lean twin-engine Shadow fitted with upward-firing cannon that could slide beneath a target and rake its belly without ever touching the glare. On paper, the balance should have shifted. It did not, because paper cannot buy fuel. Radar sets that looked authoritative in diagrams flickered on thin power and thinner maintenance. A lattice of early warning posts had holes you could sail a convoy through, and the gaps were widest where the cats liked to work. Low along mangroves, under weather, inside the noise of surf. Training pipelines, compressed by crisis, turned students into crews in weeks. They learned the checklist, but not the night. Meanwhile, the Catalina community chose its fights with a miser's care-up moon, upwind, off-axis, always at an hour when the human brain is least sharp, when searchlights finally formed a cone. The flare ship had already drifted its sun to spoil the geometry, and the strikers were leaving black water behind them. The Gecko could hurt you if it found you, but finding was the tax it could seldom pay. Thin radar coverage meant vectors came late. Fuel rationing meant a pilot could not loiter long enough to solve a low, slow target that refused to silhouette against the sky. Even when a merge happened, the Cats' one-pass doctrine strike and vanish left little time for a fighter to get into that perfect belly-shot position. A few Catalinas fell. More came home with new holes and old habits. The ratio stayed lopsided not because the defenders lacked courage, but because their system could not keep pace with a patient modular attack that started at dusk, ended at dawn, and demanded reliability they could not afford. The psychological turn cut deeper than the statistics. Crews slept in boots now. Fire hoses were flaked and charged before sunset. Bosun's mates kept steam up all night because a cold plant meant a still ship, and a still ship meant a lantern in a hunter's hand. On deck, voices dropped to whispers by habit. Men flinched at goals. Harbor masters forbade smoking topside not for discipline but because a single ember could ruin a dark-adapted eye. The night, once a refuge, became a workplace for fear. Long stretches of nothing. Then a hiss, a noon-bright flare, and seconds to make choices that felt like verdicts. The counters bred their own mistakes. Cones of light blinded gun crews at the worst moment. Pre-sighted lanes punished friendly boats that panicked and bolted across them. Night fighters chasing radar ghosts wasted fuel and nerve on reflections from squalls and reefs. False alarms bred fatigue, and fatigue wrecked aim. Meanwhile, the Catalinas refined the quiet arithmetic. One flare placed to split two defenses. One skip bomb dropped where a tender could block an exit. One minefield zone where the tide must carry tomorrow's resupply. The Cats were never trying to win a duel. They were trying to break a schedule. And they did, over and over, until timetables turned into wishes. A vignette tells the truth cleaner than a table. In a Huon backwater, a harbor battery drills all week on a perfect cone. The first real raid comes at the dog hour. The flare blooms not over the anchorage but up current, and searchlights obediently stitch white bars through smoke while the strikers work from the dark edges, off-axis, at mast height. Guns thunder where the flare tells them. The kills happen where the doctrine says they will. By dawn, a tender burns at its moorings, and the channel carries a ribbon of oil to sea. The battery chief writes engaged in his log and does not write effective. By season's end, the adaptations remain, the losses remain, and the hunger remains. Ammunition quotas shrink, rice thins. Medicine becomes rumor. The night fighter squadrons that promised rescue ask for fuel they do not get. Searchlight crews keep practicing because practicing is something to do. But the lesson your audience knows proves itself again. Hardware without tempo is decoration. The Black Cats keep the tempo, choosing hour, angle, and exit, and the defenders bleed. Not for lack of bravery, but because the night now belongs to a system that multiplies small certainties faster than they can answer. The ledger of the night is written in hours, not headlines. Catalina squadrons across the theater logged thousands of hours on station each month. A quiet tide of endurance that never makes a single dramatic claim, and yet moves campaigns. A single patrol could last well over a dozen hours, gliding from reef line to river mouth, circling a channel mouth until tide and schedule forced movement. Faster, shinier machines could flash through a harbor once. The slow-flying boat waited until the target had no choice but to appear. Inside operations tents, barge counts became a staff obsession. Chalk lines on boards tracked strings destroyed, strings scattered, strings that failed to arrive. Over a season, coastal traffic did not dip by accident. It declined by hundreds through nightly attrition. One raft burned here, one lighter mine there, one tender hold at the waterline in a flare-lit minute that no gun crew could take back. The math looked small at midnight and enormous by month's end. A platoon eats less because a single barge did not make a turn. An outpost fires fewer rounds because a tender never cleared a channel. A front that felt solid in the morning feels hollow by the next phase line. Sorties multiplied because the aircraft could stay. Crews launched at dusk and returned at dawn with fuel still in the tanks and notes in the margins bearing current wake patterns. The hour a harbor stirred. Those notes turned into routes. Routes turned into habits. Habits turned into trap lines that bled logistics without offering a fair shot in return. Losses happened. Some cats did not come back. Others limped in with holes and stories, but the exchange favored the patient hunter. An enemy spent tons of fuel and stacks of ammunition to defend a lane the Catalina denied with a flare, a mine, and a bomb timed in seconds. The cost curve was the quiet killer. A slow-flying boat burned far less fuel per hour than a fast-attack aircraft and demanded simpler maintenance. Yet its endurance denied more fuel, food, and time to the enemy than any day raid could at night. One cat loitering at mast height for an hour could erase a convoy's worth of planning. Two cats working in relay could turn a coastline into a curfew. Add a pair of PT boats and a dawn wave of B-25s or Beaufighters. And the cheapest hour in the theaters suddenly produced the most expensive result for the other side. Empty warehouses. Hungry garrisons and timetables rewritten in pencil. Commanders learned to read the numbers like weather. When barge counts rose, outposts recovered. When the graph bent downward, patrol reports began to mention thin rice, borrowed ammunition, and sick bays out of medicine. The Catalinas never needed to claim grand totals. They needed only to keep time, to show up often enough that defenders kept steam up all night, burned fuel they could not replace, and watched searchlight crews exhaust themselves chasing shadows. Every hour a cat was overhead was an hour the enemy could not move with confidence. In this arithmetic, losses were measured not only in hulls but in hours the enemy failed to use. The night that should have delivered a dozen barges delivered 3. The week that should have stocked a regiment stocked a company. The month that should have stabilized a line produced a retreat. None of it looked spectacular from altitude. All of it was decisive on the ground. When historians later traced the arc from strongholds to surrender, they found the same thin ink running along the margins, a slow airplane that did not sleep, and a coastline that forgot how to feed a war. The Catalina came in up moon over Rabaul and let the first flare fall like a truth. Noon bloomed across the inner anchorage, turning lighters and stacked oil drums into hard-edged sketches. while searchlights clawed the glare and blinded their own gunners. The flare ship did not rush the strike. It arranged the board with smoke floats laid in the tide and bearings called in clipped words, while a sister cat slid to the channel mouth and sowed mines where tomorrow's traffic had no choice but to pass. Only then did the strikers enter, low and off-axis, skipping bombs across water into a tender's soft seams. Sirens finally found their voices as the cats drifted to the seaplane ramps and harassed them with brief, accurate bursts that turned concrete into ladders of sparks. When darkness reclaimed the harbor, the channel was a quiet argument waiting for morning. The ramps a bruise that would ache for weeks, and the lesson hung in the smoke. The night had chosen sides. Far to the north, Kavieng tried a careful resupply under a moon that seemed friendly. A string of barges and small lighters nosed out of cover at slack water, trusting routine more than luck. A flare blossomed downwind and painted the line in white fire while a patrol craft blinked confusion into the glare. The first Catalina took the outside track at mast height, leveled, and loosed a bomb that skipped twice and bit just under a bow. Another cat raked lashings until cargo shifted and turned good helmsmen clumsy. Within heartbeats the line broke. One barge slewed across the next. A third lost nerve and grounded on a shoal, and the patrol craft tried to play shield and became the target instead. South in Shortland harbors the pattern repeated without flourish: one white sun, one fast pass, one clean exitend. A plan that had looked tidy at dusk turned into wreckage before the clock could call it midnight. By dawn the lanes were cluttered with oil and regret, and the day's schedule was already fantasy. Along Bougainville's coast where mangroves breathe and reefs bite, a barge train crept in silence, with holes chained bow to stern so no weak engine could betray the timetable. The Catalina found them first by smell and sense, then by radar whisper. There were no speeches on the radio, only bearing, range, and wind. The flare turned coastline into stage, and the opening act was simple. One pass, one skip, one fuse set to a short, merciless delay. Fuel drums bloomed, lashings snapped. The chain became a single burning line that wrote itself across the tide in orange cursive visible for miles. A few boats cut engines and hoped stillness could make them stones. The cats answered by seeding the mouth with mines and strafing the margins to keep panic honest. Darkness swallowed the scene again, but the fire did not go with it. It burned through the small hours, an unpaid bill no reconnaissance flight could ignore. And when the sun finally climbed, smoke pointed seaward like a confession. None of these nights were glamorous. All were disciplined. Flares fixed the picture, bombs signed it, mines edited the parts no one could see. Each harbor and inlet learned the same sentence in a different accent. A slow black wing could arrive when it wished, choose the angle that hurt most, and leave without offering a duel. By season's end, even the officers who once joked about flying boats spoke more softly on the quay, because they understood what the charts could not admit. The night belonged to the cats. By noon the sea looked clean and empty, the way oceans lie, until a thin voice came over the set, broken. Saltbit, a mayday that named a grid not far from a hostile coast. The Catalina that had marked barges the night before turned its long black wing toward the call without ceremony. Weight came off first, loose gear stowed, a few rounds jettisoned, because a flying boat that means to land in rough job must promise its hull every kindness. Smoke flares bloomed ahead in orange puffs, dye spread like bruises on the swells, and a shard of a wing bobbed in the troughs. Somewhere in that moving field of green and glare, two men were still alive. The pilot circled once to read the sea, trading altitude for knowledge. Swells ran long from the east. A crosswind bullied the crests into small white fists. He lined up along the swell and let the throttles down through a practiced ladder. Props low and even cowl flaps set for the moment the ocean would cease being scenery. The hull kissed a crest, skipped, and then struck true. A hard slam followed by a groan that every cat crew knows by heart. Spray hammered the blister windows. The airplane was a boat now. Taxiing in Choppa's translation, wind into angles, waves into time. The boat lifted, fell, lifted again. A crewman cracked the blister and the world rushed in, salt and oil and the sweet sour of flare smoke. He spotted a head, an arm, then a raft half lost under a swell. A swimmer went out on a line without drama, just a nod and a coil of rope, and came back with the first man, his flight suit black with water and something darker. Hands hauled him through the blister hatch, boots scraping paint, and a corpsman cut a sleeve. Set a tourniquet, pressed a morphine syringe into a shaking thigh. Airmen came aboard cursing in a voice that meant he would live. Someone laughed once quickly because relief needs a sound. Shore guns might have been there, fighters might have been there. Sharks are always rumored. The crew had no room for ghosts. Engines idled against the drift while the pilot waited for a window between sets, a breath in the sea's chest. When it came, he fed in power, smooth and sure. The hull shouldered aside green water and began the long, stubborn slide that every Catalina must make before it flies again. Spray climbed the windows, then fell behind. The bow found a plane. The heavy boat skimmed. The ocean let go. The ride home was slow and careful. The rescued lay under blankets that smelled of canvas and fuel. One of them gripped a St. Christopher. The other stared at the ceiling and counted breaths. The crew passed canteens and quiet jokes. On the ramp hours later, medics took the stretchers, and the big black airplane sat with its belly still dripping, looking both ancient and exactly right. The men who had burned barges last night had pulled strangers out of a hard sea today, and neither job needed a speech. Viewers will tell each other that part in the comments because it is the note that turns steel into story. The same patience that hunts in darkness can kneel in daylight. And the same wing that writes fire across a harbor can lower itself onto bad water for two lives it has never met. By daylight, speed dazzles, angles matter, and a sleek fighter can write its name across the sky in contrails. But night changes the grammar of war. In darkness, the virtues that decide campaigns are not glamour but patience, not thrust but endurance, not noise but discipline. The Black Cats proved that a machine dismissed as slow could win precisely because it was slow, because it could loiter where nerves fray, because it could wait until tide and schedule forced the enemy to move. Painted in matte shadow, breathing through flame dampers, guided by simple radar and steady hands, the Catalina chose the hour, the height, and the target, and it refused every duel that did not pay. Each sortie was a quiet equation, a flare to make noon out of midnight, a skip bomb that bit at the waterline. Mine laid where tomorrow's traffic must pass, a depth charge walked along a pale wake, a clipped bearing that brought partners into the kill chain at exactly the right second. Nothing about that arithmetic was glamorous. Everything about it was decisive. The cost curve did the rest. A single patient flight hour in a flying boat denied more fuel, food, and time than a dozen brief flashes by faster machines because it bent timetables, not just hulls. Barges did not arrive. Tenders did not refuel destroyers. Warehouses emptied into silence. Outposts rationed ammunition by the handful and stretched rice into thin soup. Searchlight crews practiced cones. Night fighters clawed at ghosts. Batteries pre-sighted channels, and still the ledger slid the same way because the system beat the hardware. The Cats set the tempo, the PT boats cut with torpedoes. The dawn attackers finished the wreckage, and the enemy spent scarce fuel and courage answering a rhythm he did not control. That is the legacy, a doctrine shift your eyes can feel. Day belongs to speed. Night belongs to endurance, stealth, and discipline. The cheapest hour in the theater became the most expensive bill the enemy could pay, an empty warehouse. A hungry garrison, a convoy that never arrives. Japan believed darkness was safe, until the Black Cats turned the night itself into a weapon.